There we go. We've just heard from all of our panellists here at this SNAICC forum having a discussion about, are we creating another stolen generation? We've heard lots of different challenges from people here. We need to have heard that we need systemic approaches, political engagement, legal frameworks, some societal solutions that are going to make it better for our kids. The challenge is that by 2018, we're looking to halve the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care and in institutions, so that when we go back to the convention, we can stand up as a nation and have something to be prideful of, that we have taken responsibility. We do not, as an Australian nation, have a high tolerance for children being in institutional care. We do want to support people and families through preventative action. We are really deeply concerned about the human cost of separation. We do want to address poverty so that we can have a bigger impact on making sure that our families are supported to be the very best that they can be and nurture our children through, particularly in that 0 to 3-year-old age group. So we've heard now from all of the panellists. It's time for you, the audience, to get engaged in this discussion. We heard from Professor Bamblett that she would like to have people challenge all of the panellists to perhaps have some solutions. Not me, I'm just moderating. All of them flow over there. We've also heard then about the opportunities to put some solutions and ideas forward about how we might be able to make sure that we reach our targets. We've had a call from this panel now to have another Stolen Generations report, another Bringing Them Home report to see what the state of affairs is for kids in care. We do have a Victorian Aboriginal Child Commissioner coming in online very soon that's going to look at the experiences of the 700 children who are currently in care in Victoria, make sure that they're deeply engaged. We do have two microphones at either end of the forum if people would like to come down and ask their questions. The way that I'd like to have this happen is that you're not all going to stampede down at one time. There are some chairs along the front row here, so if you'd like to be able to make your way down so you're close, we'll get it happening fairly quickly. And just to state your name, where you're from, and ask the question. So, in that instance, while we're waiting for people to come on down to ask a question, even if it's a Dorothy Dixer, we'd be very happy to hear you. But first of all, perhaps to Megan. We've talked a little bit about how important it is to make sure that Aboriginal children get their voices heard and taken into account in decisions about their care and protection. Have you got comments around that? Usually children are very difficult to have or to be seen as people who've got some will that they can assert in any of these processes. So how important is that?
Well, as Children's Commissioner, I think it's really important. I think we've got a long way to go in this country in terms of child participation, and in particular having children's voices heard in decisions that impact on them. And I think most care and protection systems and the laws that govern them around the states and territories actually do contain provisions to engage children in decision making. But most care and protection systems around the country don't do it. And so I think this is partly something about those systems being much more accountable and transparent than they are. They also have, in many cases, provisions to engage Aboriginal people and consult with Aboriginal communities in the placements, but they don't necessarily do it. And I think, so when we're talking about the practice here, as well as just the policies and the laws, we really need to shine a really big light on what's actually happening as opposed to what we think might be happening. And I guess from the point of view, I mean, if you engage children in decision making, you're also empowering them. It's a very disempowering situation to be taken into care. You're a passive recipient of a system potentially for 18 years. And so by engaging children in decision making, you actually are empowering them. And most Aboriginal kids will probably tell you, I want to stay at home and I want to stay with my family. And in fact, they demonstrate that by walking out of placements and going back home. And so while they mightn't have a voice, eventually they usually end up at home anyway. And so I think we have to confront that reality also.
Thank you very much. Professor Bamblett, have you got a comment on that? And then we'll come over to you.
I was on the Youth Parole Board, and one of the interesting things, or just really concerning things, was actually knowing that the Youth Parole Board was actually the first time, and a lot of the young people that are in the juvenile justice system have a history of being in out-of-home care. But one of the things that was really astounding was to find out that it was the first time we actually spoke to the young person about what was happening for them, what happened for them in their care experience, what happened to them and how they felt going into the care system. So I think we have a really major flaw with our system in that we don't actually hear from children. I think we hear from parents about what they think are happening for children, but I still don't think we hear about children. I think that Queensland is a perfect example. Queensland, a few years ago, introduced through Create, wanted to hear the voice of children, and in Queensland they have what they call the Aboriginal Visitor Program. So an Aboriginal person will visit Aboriginal children. The first time they did the survey, the feedback from the young people was terrible, and I think it embarrassed the government, but it was a great way to actually get the system to better listen to children. And now the government up in Queensland is really focusing more about how do we hear the voice of children and young people. I think our system is fundamentally flawed. I think too many things happen for children in the system that we don't hear from. But I don't think it just applies. I think we need to make sure that our society is safe for children, that children are involved in all aspects of, decision making, not just isolated to child protection and child welfare.
Thank you very much. We have a question.
Yes. Cool. Hey, my name's Elliot. I'm from Melbourne. Thanks to all the panellists. It was a really great discussion. My question just relates to whether the panel agrees that the bipartisan support for the Northern Territory intervention has proven ineffective and more so actually a real barrier to overcoming Indigenous disadvantage. And just on two levels. One, I think it's ineffective at addressing poverty, which we've sort of talked about as one of the key roots. Just one mechanism, cutting community development and the employment program is actually, a serious step backwards, I think, actually. And similarly, investment wasted on, bureaucrats or income management. And secondly, that the underlying framing of, the policy and the policies it implements are based on very, I think, disciplinary, paternalistic measures, such as income management, the erosion of community control, blanket bans, and of course child removal, I think, is part of that process. So, does the panel agree that we have to, reverse these steps and actually promote, just give it an alternative, something like from the ground up, the UTS Jumbana proposal, which essentially says that we need to, more investment into community control, community development and employment program, and none of these paternalistic measures. So,
Thank you very much for that question. I'll open it to the panel. We've got a couple here. Perhaps Marta first.
Yeah, actually, thank you. Thank you for that comment. I'm not an expert on Australia. The experts on Australia are all of you. But I have learned in these days and going through all the documentation that was presented to the committee that there are concrete things happening on the ground. There are best practices that can be learned from. And in fact, last week, the National Conference of SNAICC in Cairns was a demonstration of that. Hundreds and hundreds of best practices. The thing is that the light has to be shed on them. And there are issues that will need to be addressed. Like, for example, one of the things that I clearly learned was that the child placement principles, have been diminishing in their application. Part of the problem is that the definitions of the principles, an issue like, for example, neglect, needs to be defined culturally and in the specific context. What is neglect? Specifically. And it is clear in the Northern Territories, for example, the emergency response to sexual abuse was so disproportionate precisely because it hadn't addressed what sexual abuse, neglect, and the other issues really meant for each and every community. You know, it was to me so clear when people were saying, well, you know, a social worker comes into my house and because there's a mattress lying in my living room, you know, I'm immediately being told that I'm, you know, that there's too many people living in this house, that not enough care is being taken, and therefore children are in danger of being removed because there's a mattress lying on the, in the living room, you know, which is part of the culture of being hospitable, no? And so what I'm saying, in a long-winded way, I'm sorry, is that we need to define quite clearly and in a very specific cultural context what these criteria are. And in that sense, coming back to the best principles, the best interests of the child principle that Megan was mentioning. Best principles of the child is one of the, as you know, one of the 4 principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's a right for all children to have its interests, his or her interests, be taken into consideration in a preeminent way, first and foremost. And that's it's a very tricky, Megan was saying, but at the same time, it's a simple thing. It's the individual child and his or her context and the interests of that child in the present moment and in his future that needs to be taken into account. And that has to be described, now in specific terms in each of the programs. And finally, let me just say that I know that it's difficult to bring in the element of participation into the execution of programs, but there are examples out there. Contracts, for example, between local community organizations and other organizations, including government services, are working in New South Wales, as I understand it. So let's look at the best practices and bring out of that, you know, the standards and the principles that then need to be brought back into the specific context and applied. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Marta. Let's hear from Professor, and then we'll go over to Helen.
Yeah, I think that I think we have to marry this up with the Convention on the Rights of the Child for the Northern Territory, because we know that it's an international treaty and it's about protecting children. And I do believe in the Northern Territory that children's best interests aren't being protected. I think that, you know, there's a right to protect children. The UN Convention, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, talks about protection of Aboriginal children from discrimination. Well, Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory get discriminated against every day. You've got, you know, best interests, you've got cultural rights, access to your language, religion. Those things are being basically eroded every day. So, you know, your rights to preserve your identity, your rights to have connection to your country, you know, the rights, it also says to hear the voice of the child, that children have rights under the Convention. So, you know, children have spiritual rights, cultural rights, health and education. All of those are rights that every Aboriginal child has a right to in this country. But is Australia complying with it? Particularly not in the Northern Territory. It is criminal to see what is happening for children there. There are, you know, up to 20 and 30 people sleeping in a house. Can they keep children safe? Is it because of an enforced system of no housing? There's no housing, chronic housing, no housing for, so our people are crowded into accommodation. How do you keep children safe living in those environments? Is it Aboriginal problem or is it society's problem? And I think we've got to tackle these real issues. We cannot keep children safe in environments where they're being neglected and there's a chronic neglect of our people. I think that we have to be able to do something, and it's not just non-Aboriginal people, it's Aboriginal people everywhere fighting to say that it just doesn't happen though in the Northern Territory. It happens in parts of Western Australia, parts of Queensland. It is what happens for Aboriginal children should be put out there. We should shine the light on it, but we should do something about it.
Thank you very much. They're very important points. We'll come along to the second question now from the audience.
Thank you. Helen Faulkner from the Australian Foster Care Association. We're a voluntary organisation which advocates and supports foster carers across Australia and the children for whom they care. I wanted to pick up on something that Eva Jo was mentioning before, that of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Don't look worried, it's okay. Children in foster care with non-Aboriginal carers. There are two aspects of this which I think are potentially solvable with a bit of pressure and money. The first is the correct identification of children as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. I know of foster carers who have children in their care who've had them for quite some time, and then they're told that they're Aboriginal or of Aboriginal descent. If we can pressure our state and territory departments into actually flagging the children's cultural identity all through the system, you're going to have a better chance of then having some form of connection and hopefully reconnection to kin. And the second is the chronic underfunding of organisations whose role it is to support children, Aboriginal children in non-Aboriginal placements and obviously reconnect. Muriel was talking about funding in Victoria for 300 children out of probably about 500. This sort of thing is obviously inadequate, so we need to pressure our departments for funding for that. Because I find that foster carers often feel inadequate in either not necessarily attending functions, but inadequate in what to do, but more importantly, they don't want to do the wrong thing.
Yes, no,
and that's really, really important.
So in terms of a question, do you have a question
no,
for the
it's
panel?
really a statement. Is that
okay?
Oh, okay.
No worries. Thank you very much for that statement. I appreciate the role of responsibilities of foster carers. Thank you. Do we have a question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for a wonderful session. I came here because I had no idea of the extent of the problem that's going on, so I'm delighted to be here and to be in the presence of great speakers. I'm from Trobe University, the business school, and I've done some PhD work in the history of removals in New South Wales and the role of accounting and business management in that. So I'm interested in your comments, Helen, and also the other comments about financing, how the lack of transparency and how all of this is funded and interrelated, and how we need to make a business case to demonstrate the cost of social inequality that underpins the ideas of neglect. And I very much concur with what I've seen and read and hear, that this is institutionalised and systemic across organisations. And Aunty Lorraine points out that this silo mentality needs to be addressed. So I'd be interested, Helen, in your comments as to how you see how we can make a contribution to building the business case, to support the social case, to bring about a social and political response, because without both aspects, I think we're in for a dire time with the impending change of government. So I'd appreciate your comments.
Thanks for the question. Well, I think numbers aren't my strong point, but I think there's, between now and September in particular, there's an opportunity to try to do some modelling, and I'm sure this has been done in the juvenile justice system around the kind of cost to the community of keeping kids in care and the kind of opportunity costs and all of that sort of thing. But and I would think the same thing could be done around the child protection system. Some modelling around the cost of having a child in care versus the costs of actually perhaps doing some of the things that have been suggested here, which is investing in communities, doing the preventative work. How much does Aunty Lorraine's cultural training cost, and what is the impact of that versus what it costs to actually run a care system and, not have the sort of mechanisms in place. And as I said, I'm sure some of that's been done. But I also, just in listening to the discussion and the little bit I know about this area, I also think around the funding side of things, one of the things that governments don't understand, one of the things, dare I say it, that FACSIA and the good public servants that are trying to do the right thing there don't understand is the actual concept of participation and involvement in decision making. And there's a view, I think, that somehow Aboriginal communities are homogenous in their opinions about different things, where in fact Aboriginal people are no different to other people. They live a life, they have a community, there are competing tensions, competing demands. And I wonder whether we shouldn't be advocating something, and this goes back to the original question, and I can't see where the questioner is now, but whether we say for every dollar spent on child protection, on health, on education, or whatever the case may be, 10% of that has to actually go to resourcing communities to set up decision-making structures, whether you call that Aboriginal controlled organisations, whether you call it local governance or whatever the case may be. But I think we just don't get that in order for people to take control of their lives, there have to be mechanisms that are supported and resourced to enable them to do that. And if that means that for a decade we institutionalise that in funding, instead of, there are billions of dollars that go into Aboriginal health and welfare across the country, and the community, I think it's fair to say, are not getting value for money, and they're not getting value for money because they're not getting what they say they need. So, that's just a simple kind of suggestion about let's demand that X percent of every dollar is actually gone into capacity building. So it doesn't quite deal with your question, but it's two suggestions.
Thank you very much. Just before we go back, can I please also hear from Megan and perhaps from Muriel on that particular issue?
I think there's a lot of opportunity to make a business case. I kind of added up the figures myself, and it's about $3 billion a year goes into just the child protection system in Australia, that, let alone all the other aspects of those systems and all the healthcare and all the other aspects of it. And I really think we could do much better with that money. And just as I'm working with Commissioner Gooder on a justice reinvestment approach, I think we really need to think about a care reinvestment approach, and that was one of the things I was getting at. If we're spending over $70,000 a child, and there's 40,000 of them now in care every year for 18 years, I think we can use that money probably quite a bit more wisely. And I really like the idea of resourcing local decision-making groups. I think that's a really good idea. But one of the challenges we have, of course, is child protection systems are state. We have a lovely federation. It's very challenging because child protection systems are state systems, and so where the Commonwealth can bring its influence, and I think there is already a framework here that it can use, which is called the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children. It can really drive that kind of consistency across the states and territory, and in terms of care reinvestment as a concept, it can drive it through that process in particular. So.
Thank you for that, Megan. We'll hear.
Just to let you know that Deloitte did do some work. So if you look in the Victorian Child Protection Inquiry into their full report, they actually look at the costs of not only child welfare but then graduation to juvenile justice. Then if obviously outcomes for those involved in child protection mean that long-term unemployment, mental health, and so they actually did a costing. So it's quite exhaustive, and I think it actually sets the argument as to why you want to act now. But I think you're conservative in some of your costs around the costs of children, because we know that some of our children can cost up to $200,000, $800,000 a year.
Wow.
So some of our children, the most complex of our children, are actually requiring huge resources, huge capacity. So I think you really need to understand that it's very complex and it's very expensive.
Thank you very much. No, you can't, sorry. We've got another couple of questions here for about 5 or 6 different questions, so let's hear from this question.
Hi, my name's Shireen Minicon. I'm a Yoda woman and I work for MacKillop Family Services. I have 2 quick things. One is some feedback for you, Megan, around what young people say to me about wanting to be able to research and find out who they are before the age of 18. So looking at where there's opportunities to be able to access things that the older generations can, such as link up, but it's harder if you're under the age of 18 to be able to find out about your identity. The second thing, and it's a question, is around the amount of young people that get referred to us from the government to our organisation where their identity is marked as unknown. And I think we have 2 types of kids that are coming in, the ones that know they're Aboriginal and the ones who don't necessarily know or don't want to identify. There's best practice guidelines in the health sector around how we do Aboriginal identity and recording and all that kind of stuff. So I'd like to ask the panel what they think about the development of best practice guidelines for Aboriginal identification in the child protection system and what the broader implications for that are with the broader complexities of Aboriginal identity and the debates and issues around that.
Thank you so much. That's a good question. Who from the panel here might like to have a go at answering it?
Just with regard to identity, I think that's the major flaw in our system and and I know that we had somebody from the UN come out and I did a talk to the Family Violence Prevention Legal Service, and one of the things that really is absence is having children have their Aboriginality confirmed, knowing where they come from, and just giving them basic information about their Aboriginality, about doing a genealogy, who are your family, where are you from. Most Aboriginal children in the care system do not get that basic information. Now, to me, it is a right for Aboriginal children to know their heritage. It should be their right to have their genealogy, and it should be their right to be able to claim all of that comes with the entitlement of being Aboriginal, and that's native title, the right to identify with your people, your language, and learn that. We as a system do not do that at all, and I think that only few Aboriginal services do it, but it's not. And it's Australia's national shame that children in the care system do not have their identity confirmed and that children struggle and grow up not knowing where they come from.
Aunty Lorraine?
Yeah, just on my own experience, all Aboriginal children taken into care do have files, right, where you can access them and find out who you do belong to and where you come from. Now, to do this, governments have set up the link-up organisations, bringing them home. Counsellors can help you with this, and they've got various agencies within different states. To find you were taken because you were an Aboriginal child, but then now as an adult you've got to turn around and have a piece of paper to prove that you are. To get that confirmation of Aboriginality, they tell you have to go back to where you come from. Now, I didn't grow up in my community. They don't know me. So how could they give me a written piece of paper to say who I am, that I am Aboriginal? So the circle just keeps turning. Nobody's putting their hand up and saying, well, yes, we'll claim her, or you go back to where you were brought up. That's not my country, they keep telling me. So I'm told to go to my own country. If you haven't found that information out of where you come from, you are still lost within the system. Unless you know of elders within your community that know in the community where you live, where you come from, then only then you will know where you come from. But can I just say, we have a couple of generations of children walking around your age, maybe a bit older, that will never ever know where they come from, because the mothers have been told those children had died at birth. Now the mothers have grieved that death. The children are coming back wanting to be claimed, but the mothers grieved the death of that child. So it's a real mess out there at the moment. We have people, even like Eva Jo's generation and her children and maybe her grannies, that are suffering this colonisation trauma. This is where the trauma started. So not too many people in this country are trauma-informed about stolen gen, and we need to get that out there. We need to teach people that and educate people of what we're going through. Not only my generation, but Eva Jo's grannies, you know, and my great-grannies. So until we break this cycle somewhere, I don't know how it's going to happen. There are, you know, there are some solutions around, but not too many. But I can't believe that children being taken in care are not being told where they come from or who they belong to. It's outrageous. Thank you.
At the University of Melbourne at ANEMDA, we have started a Victorian genealogical base that helps people make those linkages, and we are starting to tell young people who have been institutionalised, and the change and transformation in their lives is remarkable. So please come and look us up at ANEMDA. That would be fine. We'd be very, very happy to help wherever we could. Sir.
My name's Jeremy. I'm a White Ribbon ambassador, and we understand the extent to which violence against women is the most pervasive and systematic human rights abuse in the world, and my understanding is that violence against women in the Aboriginal communities is also a very big issue. The sort of rhetoric is changing in terms of prevention of violence, where we're talking about upstream. How do we prevent it occurring in the first place so that we don't have to deal with the issues downstream and the costs associated? So my question is simply, looking at trying to change the preconditions so that children don't have to be removed, to what extent does violence against women within families play a big factor in that? Is it being addressed? Are the men engaging in this issue and becoming part of the solution, realising that choices are made every time violence occurs? And to what extent, in terms of, rather than speaking about the secondary and tertiary responses to this, in terms of primary response, so that children don't have to be removed, to what extent does this issue play a big part in it, and to what extent is it being addressed?
Thank you very much. Anyone from the panel?
I can, but I feel like I'm answering all the questions.
You go right ahead, sister.
I think that family violence is a significant issue, and if you look at the data on children, I think that 52% of children that come into care come in because of family violence. For Aboriginal, we get funded for work with children at the Centre of Family Violence, and about 60% of our cases coming in at the moment are family violence. I think that the government investing in Victoria probably leads as far as its work around working with men around family violence is having significant results. I think the White Ribbon ambassadors, including football teams, including men where they are, and making some really strong stands is a positive for Aboriginal. I think engaging men has to be, obviously a starting point, but I think that we also need to do a lot more work around parenting, around relationship counselling, around supporting women to say no to violence. A lot of our women have learnt through generational abuse to accept abuse, and so we need to change the psyche of our, women, particularly young women. If he doesn't hit me, he doesn't love me. Changing a lot of those values that we have in our communities, but also a lot of our systems still focus on the adults in family violence and not on the children and the impact of their violence on children. And so a lot of what we're looking at in Victoria is how do we actually look at trauma and how do we look at grief loss. If you look at how much grief loss and trauma that Aboriginal children are exposed to on a daily basis, violence is there, there's mental health, they're experiencing the loss of, family on a regular basis. So there's so much that happens for children. And I'm telling you that a lot of those children, when they come in, they're so severely damaged that we have to do so much work. Grief, loss and trauma, we have to really do a lot of work very early with children to address their trauma. So I think it's holistic, but I think the absence of men in child welfare is significant. We do not have a lot of Aboriginal men, particularly, who are coming forward to take children when children are at risk. We don't even, quite often we don't even ask the question, where's the father?
Yeah. Which is ridiculous. But anyway. Sure.
Behaviours learnt, Yep. So violence is part of that behaviour from trauma. The rage against, if you go through a healing process, that's all part of the rage against the system, and you do act that out. You need to ask where that violence is coming from. You need to ask where alcohol's coming from, and the drug use as well. It's all 9 times out of 10 trauma related. Ask why, the question why. And then that's why I think the parents will need that help. You know, they don't know why they're acting like they are, most times. I'm not excusing the fact that some of them are, but violence goes with trauma, and it needs to be addressed. These people need to be healed.
My big bugbear is that men are so absent in a policy context as fathers. So, for example, we have mothers and children's spaces, but we don't have parents and children's spaces. So I think that there is a lot more work that can be done to make men and their roles and responsibilities in families more visible in a policy context. I think that there is a lot more work that can be done in supporting men be the very best they can be, and instead of perpetrating them all as pedophiles and as bashers, that we should start to really change our perceptions and roles of men. And I think that for me that was the most damaging thing that happened through the NT intervention, was that men were too afraid then in public to hold the hands of their children, and it was just another way of being able to sever those roles and responsibilities with their kids, because they were just under such public scrutiny for such a long time about what is their real role and responsibility with that child. Are they there to harm them, and not their nurturance and capacity for nurturance and to be loving to their children has not been spoken about in very public ways in public forums before. But thank you very much for that question. Look, there are about 3 or 4 more questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them today, but I think it is really important to note that these kinds of issues are up for public discussion. You want to be able to have access to people. You do want to be able to step up. We are genuinely concerned as Australians to halve the gap or halve the number, I should say, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care and in institutions by 2018. This is a very important campaign for all Australians to get behind. We have got a number of our peak body organisations here. I can see the National Healing Foundation CEO, Richard Weston. I can see representatives from the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. I know that SNAICC is also engaged in that leadership group who are really leading the charge on how we address these kinds of issues into the future. We've probably got time for one more question, and as is my right as the maitre d' of the proceedings today, if it's all right, I might ask it. Is that okay? Thank you. My apologies. But I think it's an important one, and it really is that issue of accountability. Who needs to be accountable for doing things differently and ensuring we don't have another stolen generation? And I think it's really some important remarks from each of the panellists. I'll ask you each in closing to be able to state that case. So who does need to be accountable for doing things differently and ensuring we don't have another stolen generation? We might start with Eva, if that's okay.
I guess accountability, I believe it begins with us. I also believe that our government needs to be accountable for what isn't happening. I guess I would like to see a lot more done with our parents, with our parents from the stolen generation, is considering, I know it's also that's buzzing. Anyway, I guess I just wanted to, make a statement in that sense of, to who's held accountable. If we're not looking after those children that have come out of our system and that are producing more children that are going to be removed, I don't know, I have a problem with us. I just can't get it out. But yeah, if we've got to start to heal those children that are coming out of our system.
Yeah.
You know, we have the genograms and things like that of where we come, but when we do release from institutionalisation of foster care, I guess we're another lost. You know, community, we're lost out from our communities and we're separated. So I guess it's we as a community, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, are accountable for our children within the care system and our governments.
Thank you very much for that, Eva. Helen, final comment?
Well, I'm really pushing, I think, that there has to be political leadership on this issue, because the challenge has to be owned across Australia, and it needs to be understood and articulated, and, you know, it's a good time to do it. Notwithstanding, I understand states run, you know, child protection systems, but, you know, we do need someone to start to step up to this and to show that leadership, and I think that's what we should be lobbying and advocating for.
Thank you very much. Megan?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I think all of us who play leadership roles need to be accountable for taking this issue forward, and ensuring that the public understands and the community understands the extent of the issue and also the repercussions into generations. And I don't think there is a deep understanding in the community. I think our politicians and our governments also need to be accountable, and I think child protection systems in particular are very closed systems, and I think anything we can do to open them up to further scrutiny is a very good strategy. I also think if we want to empower families and communities to squarely be at the centre of decision making, then they too have to step up and be responsible and accountable for the decisions that are made and the ongoing care and support for children in those communities. I think the only way you're going to convince governments to let that happen is to be willing to take on the accountability for what happens from that point on. But I do agree that it needs to be resourced. And obviously the governments are ultimately responsible to all of us. We vote for them. We need to make a noise about what's important to us.
Thank you, Megan. Marta?
Thank you very much. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is very clear with regard to the fact that it is the parents, first and foremost, and the society at large that are responsible for ensuring that ensuring children's well-being, and that the state obligation is to ensure that that is possible. Mm-hmm. So provide the conditions, produce the context, the conditions, the policies, the programs, the resources, so that then communities and parents and families can take care of their children and ensure at the same time that children themselves have a space in that and an opportunity in defining that. And it is the state obligation to respect. It is not the government as such. It is all governments. It is the successive governments. So even if there is a change in government, and the colour government in September, still the obligations of the state are there. They were signed up, Australia ratified the convention, and therefore it is the obligation of the state, and that means of all the governments and of each and every body. Let me just maybe quickly say that no, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Aunty Lorraine.
Oh, I'm going to be a little bit personal here. I've sat 40 years ago with the same topic. So there's been no resolve, and who's accountable for all this of no solutions around the place? Can we blame anybody? I think we all have to put and step up and make changes right across the board, black and white. So we can't do without each other. Our children are being removed at such a rate that it's I feel really sick in the stomach every time I look at the stats. Who's going to be there for those children in 18 years' time when they will trigger into trauma and wanting to know where they come from or who their families are? Who's accountable for this? Thank you.
I agree it does take political leadership. I think that it takes, obviously, we need to have systemic change, but we also need to hold the government accountable for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I think there should be a report card that they are held accountable to, for, particularly for Aboriginal children. But we've got international bodies, we've got UNICEF, we've got Oxfam and all of those, and they tend to look at and report on mostly on other countries. I don't think they go deep enough, and I think we need to challenge them to go much deeper than what they do. It will take brave people. I think it will take Aboriginal people to be in the driving seat. I think we can't accept less outcomes for our own people and lower standards, and we have to take it up. I think it's not about a few people. I think it's about engaging our community. I think so many of our people have become disempowered by the past, that they don't think that they have any self-determining muscles, that they don't have the power to be self-determining and self-managing. So we have to give back a lot of that power. I think we go too often we go overseas and look for the answers there and don't look for the answers in our own country. I think that it's not about taking the culture out of the country, it's about putting Aboriginal culture back into our country and having Aboriginal culture as part of our practice and who we are. I think there's too much rolling us out when there's a big national event and then putting us back in the cupboard for the rest of the time, or putting us in the media as something to be ashamed of. So I think we need to act.
Thank you very much. Well, we've just heard from our experts who are leaders in this country and who are operating on a range of different levels, from local communities across regions, within states, nationally and internationally, on this very important and powerful issue on the most precious asset of any culture or any civilisation, and that is our children. We've just had the forum here about creating another stolen generation. Is that what we're actually doing? We've been encouraged to really participate in the campaign to step up, and the challenge for that is to halve the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care and in institutions by 2018. I really want to thank all of you as a passionate, interested audience who've come along today and made time out of your busy schedules to hear from the panellists and to really engage with the complexity of the issues in which we're all talking and working. My very sincere apologies to those of you who did have questions and didn't get a chance to participate in this forum, but I can guarantee that this is just the very beginning part of this conversation. It is in no way the end, and I'd like to see that passion carried through from this space to all across Australia. I'd like to once again thank SNAICC for demonstrating incredible leadership on this issue, and thank you very much, CEO, and to your board for organising this, all the SNAICC staff that I've had the wonderful opportunity to engage with. Thank you so much for your care and consideration and your leadership and verve in this area. To all of my fellow panellists, thank you so much again for being part of this very important conversation today. And I'm sure, like all of us, we're much more aware now of the complex array of issues affecting our children and have a better sense now of what's required to see real change happen on the ground, to generate not only positive outcomes for our children, but to give our nation a real reason to be proud. It seems like we cannot tolerate Australian children being cared for in institutions. We have made a decision loud and clear that they do need to be with our families, but we've also heard that our families need support, inclusion in this nation, and the proper place and recognition in this Australian society. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Take care, go well on your journey home, and thank you once again for being on Wurundjeri country here in this amazing Kulin nation. Bunjil's going to take us all there and look after us all, and hope all of you feel warmly embraced by loved ones when you get home. Yawul. Thank you very much.